We've got another really good UFC event this weekend. I know that this one lacks the big names and you might not be that excited for it, but matchmaking is everything. And in terms of fights, we've got some great stylistic matchups this weekend to take a deep dive into from a betting perspective. So if you are going to be betting the fights this weekend, stick around, because I have poured hours and hours and hours and hours of research into each of these fights, and I've got 15 years of experience making money betting on this sport. So you're in good hands. Sit back, relax, don't go anywhere, and hopefully we can dig up some great value bets in today's video. If you get a lot of value out of these videos, I'd also really appreciate it if you could hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. The growth is so slow for a very niche type of YouTube video like this, so you help me a lot when you just hit the like button or subscribe, just to push this video to more people and essentially make the work that I put into these videos worth it, more worthwhile. So here we go. We'll kick things off with the main event between Jamal Hill and Khalil Rountree. A fantastic fight. And what's interesting about both of these guys is we are seeing rapid improvement in Khalil Rountree, even though, you know, he is at that stage in his career at 35 years old where you'd expect him to be plateauing. He's actually getting better from fight to fight. And with Jamal Hill, I feel he's regressing. So Jamal Hill's 34, Khalil Rountree's 35. You've got two guys that are primarily strikers, but from a technical and athletic point of view, they're definitely heading on opposite career trajectories. And we're going to be diving into, you know, the specifics of what that means as we work our way through analysing this fight. First of all, though, like with anything, we need to start with the odds, because the odds will guide our decision making on this. We've got to let the odds do the work for us. If you shop around at the moment, you can bet both guys at pretty much the same odds, which will be 1.91, which is minus 110 for an implied probability of 52%. So Jamal Hill has a 79-inch reach and he's 6'4". Khalil Rountree, 76-inch reach, he's 6'1". So Hill is long and tall, a little bit longer and taller than Rountree. And prior to Hill's fight against Jiri Prohaska, I would have told you that Hill does a really good job of using his length. But there are, you know, several red flags in his overall skill set, which we saw in that performance against Jiri, which now gives us a little bit more information to work with and suggests Hill perhaps isn't quite as good at using his reach as we thought he was. So this is one of those matchups where both guys are primarily strikers, and it's extremely rare that, you know, either of these guys ever tries to take their opponent down. With that being said, we should at least have how these two match up when it comes to grappling in our mind, because MMA is a crazy unpredictable sport. You never know what'll happen. And when we're live betting a fight like this, we obviously need to know the strengths and weaknesses of both fighters. So in terms of how these two match up from a grappling point of view, even though it's rare you'll see their grappling, this is an area where Hill has a huge advantage. Now, anytime we've seen Khalil Rountree in MMA grappling positions in the past, what we know is his takedown offenses look very bad. He has looked extremely low level on the ground. And what's also very interesting about Rountree is that he's one of these unique fighters that has reasonably good cardio when striking. But anytime we've seen him, you know, forced to grapple just a little bit, just defending takedowns or clinch work, he does start to get tired very quickly. You can see his arms visibly get tired. Now, with that being said, it has been a while since Rountree's grappling was tested, because obviously Pereira's a striker, Smith isn't a particularly good offensive wrestler. The Dorcas fight ended quickly. Jacoby's a pure striker. Carl Roberson is a striker. Bukauskas never tries to take guys down. So you've really got to go all the way back to like 2019, 2020, you know, 4, 5, 6 years ago to see the last time Rountree's grappling was tested. Now, back then, his takedown offense very bad, low level on the ground, bad cardio when you make him grapple. But since then, even though Rountree, you know, has always been a technical striker, and he certainly was back then, we have seen dramatic improvement in Rountree's striking and also his cardio. Therefore, it's reasonable for us to assume that he could also have made significant improvements to his grappling. For all we know, without information to work with over the last 4 years, it's possible Rountree could actually be a better grappler than Hill now. But all we can do is make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. And based on past performances, Hill is your guy on the ground. It probably won't matter because Hill never tries to take guys down. However, it is worth considering that this is a tough stylistic matchup for Hill. He is on a 2-fight losing streak. Yes, he is one of the, I guess, bigger names in the current light heavyweight division. Therefore, it would seem counterproductive and unlikely the UFC would release him were he to lose against Rountree and go on a 3-fight losing streak. But we know quite often, more often than not, going on that dreaded 3-fight losing streak does result in a fighter being released from the promotion. And so with that being said, Hill has got a big incentive to win this weekend so that he doesn't find himself in a position where, the UFC may release him. It isn't a good time for fighters to be released by the UFC with no real other promotions at the moment paying particularly good money. Obviously, Bellator's gone. PFL are struggling a little bit. It's quite a difficult landscape in MMA at the moment. So I think a guy like Hill will probably feel that and understand the importance of holding on to his job. That could lead him to fighting smarter than he usually does. And with Rountree being a significantly better striker, in my opinion, the logical approach to this fight for Jamal Hill would be to grapple. I doubt it's going to happen. It's not that likely, but it's something that we need to be mindful of as we live bet this fight this weekend. So in terms of how they match up when it comes to striking, both guys are pretty good strikers, to be fair, in the context of light heavyweight MMA. I think the real difference between the two, though, is speed, accuracy, and defense. Those are 3 things where Rountree definitely has the edge. He's a lot faster. He's lightning fast. His kicks are devastating. He's got really fast hands. He's very accurate with the speed as well. And like I say, Rountree is one of these guys that is just tighter defensively. Hill, I hate to use the word exposed. It's a horrible word, but I can't think of any other way to word it. Hill kind of got a bit exposed against Jiri, and his striking defense looked very poor. Now, on one hand, you can put that down to Jiri's unorthodox fighting style, making him difficult to read, resulting in Hill's striking defense looking worse than usual, and perhaps Hill's striking defense will look better against a more orthodox striker than Rountree. Granted, Rountree is more technical than Jiri, but Rountree can be a more difficult puzzle to solve. But having said that, when you look at the speed and the accuracy of Rountree compared to Jiri's kind of loosey-goosiness, Jiri's very difficult to read, but speed kills in this sport, and Rountree is lightning fast. So this is one of those matchups where, based on the fact that Rountree doesn't appear to have cardio issues in stand-up fights anymore, because his cardio looked fine in round 4 against Alex Pereira after taking a ton of damage, and based on the fact that Hill is unlikely to look to grapple, you've got to lean towards Rountree this weekend, and he is a very tempting bet. I haven't decided if I'm going to bet this fight or not yet, but if I am to bet this fight, if I were to bet this fight, it would certainly be Rountree. In terms of the over-under on this one, it is a difficult one because on one hand, like, both guys are skilled strikers and pretty tough, so you could see it kind of going deep and being like a technical kickboxing match. But on the other hand, they're both quite aggressive. Like, neither of them like to take a backward step. Even after Hill was hurt multiple times against Jiri, he was still engaging and getting into like big reckless exchanges. And so Rountree doesn't like to take a backward step either. Usually when you've got two guys like that won't take a backward step, they butt heads, something has to give, and the fight will end inside the distance. So I think most likely it will end inside the distance. Obviously the odds on not to go to decision. Round 4, round 3 are pretty steep. So you're looking at that over under 2.5 rounds as the main over underline on this one, where you've got a decision to make with the odds playable on both sides. I would lean more towards under, to be honest with you, just because, like I say, both guys are so dangerous standing. 12.5 minutes is a long time for them to be in the cage with one another. So I would lean towards the under 2.5 rounds. It's not something I'm going to be betting myself, but that's my opinion on the over-under if you're tempted to take the over-under this weekend. In terms of the props, I think Rountree by knockout or TKO is the most likely outcome, but the odds obviously reflect that, with it being very, very steep favourite odds. Rountree by decision is interesting. Maybe he puts on like a 5-round technical clinic and Hill just kind of toughs it out and hangs in there and Rountree can't get the finish. If you're looking to gamble a bit this weekend to make watching the fight more interesting, I don't really like 6.0 plus 500. I would be more open to 9.0 plus 800 if that's the odds on your betting site. But what I would say about this fight is, I would just, if you want to bet this fight, I would take Rountree, and I wouldn't get too cute and overcomplicate things by taking other kinds of bets. Now let's get into the next fight on this card, which is going to be Rafael Fiziev versus Ignacio Bahamondes, which again is a fantastic stylistic matchup. If we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Bahamondes is the slight favourite at average odds of around 1.80, which is going to be minus 125 for an implied probability of 56%. We take a look at the odds on Fiziev. He is around an average of 2.05, which is going to be plus 105 for an implied probability of 49%. So when we just broke down the main event, we spoke about how Rountree is on a trajectory where he's getting better from fight to fight, and we talked about Hill showing signs of regression. I feel the same pattern applies to this matchup, where Bahamondes is definitely on that upward career trajectory. He's looking better and better every time we see him, and I do feel that Fiziev is starting to regress. And so with that in mind, what that means from a betting point of view this weekend is, if you are kind of unsure as to who you think is going to win this fight, with both guys in that even money odds range, it's more likely that Bahamondes will show up and perform better than he usually looks than Fiziev based on past performances. But if we take a look at the tail of the tape, we can see that Fiziev is 32 years old, 5'8", with a 72-inch reach, and Bahamondes is 27 years old, 6'3", with a 75-inch reach. So we can see that Bahamondes has a 4-inch reach advantage, but a huge height advantage. So when you kind of compound those two factors together, the size and the reach advantage for Bahamondes is substantial in this matchup. And Bahamondes knows how to use that reach as well, and he's getting better at using the reach. This will make the fight much more difficult for Fiziev. Size matters in MMA. We've got weight classes for a reason, and this size difference is likely going to make the fight particularly difficult for Fiziev. We can also see Bahamondes is a bit younger, but in the context of this fight, doesn't really mean a whole lot, although like I say, Fiziev in my opinion is regressing, whereas Bahamondes is improving from fight to fight. So the only other X factor that we need to mention on this one is that Fiziev is repping Azerbaijan. You can see him in his profile pic here on Tapology, rocking the Azerbaijani flag. This event is taking place in the capital of Azerbaijan this weekend, Baku, and so home advantage is something that Fiziev has in his favour, and we know home advantage can be pretty significant in countries like this. So if you are going to be betting on Bahamondes this weekend, my thoughts are, you need to either feel confident that Bahamondes can win inside the distance and take the judges out of the equation, or Bahamondes can win by a wide enough margin where it's not possible that the judges could possibly screw the decision up. Because I feel, with how we know fights can be judged in countries like this, when you've got, hometown fighters, hometown advantage, that kind of thing, I think it's going to be difficult for Bahamondes to win a decision in Azerbaijan against their most popular guy. Now, if this fight were taking place on neutral territory, I would be straight into a bet on Bahamondes, because I think the size difference is going to make life very difficult for Fiziev. But the home advantage for Fiziev does make me pump the brakes a little and feel more cautiously about this one. So just like the main event, I wouldn't expect to see any grappling in this fight. I know that Bahamondes won his last fight by triangle, but you very rarely see either of these guys try to take the other down. And both these guys like to stand and bang. They're both primarily strikers. It's very unlikely this fight will go to the ground. If the fight does go to the ground, I would give Fiziev the advantage. That smaller, more muscular, more compact frame, that scrambliness makes it difficult or more difficult to hold him down. And in some past fights, particularly the Ludwig Klein fight, Bahamondes has shown that he's pretty weak off his back. However, I wouldn't expect that to matter, because Fiziev never tries to take his opponents down. Now, I will also say this. Obviously, we were talking about Jamal Hill's need for a win this weekend, or if he loses to Rountree, he's going to be on a 3-fight losing streak. The same applies to Fiziev. If he loses this weekend to Bahamondes, he is on a 4-fight losing streak. So whilst he will have lost to two of the best guys in the division, and whilst he is an exciting, popular fighter, it is rare that the UFC will allow fighters to, have a 5th, 6th fight after losing 4 in a row. It does happen, but when it happens, it tends to be, really big names or veterans that have been around for a while, like a Tony Ferguson, right? I'm not sure where Fiziev fits into the picture with the UFC. He'll probably be alright. They'll probably keep him around. But I'm sure Fiziev doesn't want to be put in a position where his career and his destiny is in the hands of the UFC. He can take the risk of him having to go find another promotion to fight in by just winning this weekend, and that will alleviate the situation he's in with the current losing streak. It's just something to think about, because it could mean we see Fiziev fight smarter and more tactically than usual. If he's desperate for a win, he could look at that Ludwig Klein fight and think, I could probably use a similar strategy to beat Bahamondes, just based on the fact that Klein has a similar body type to Fiziev, small, muscular, compact, and naturally, even though size matters in MMA, and in a stand-up fight, the size difference between these two does give Bahamondes a significant advantage. The downside, there's always a trade-off, and that lower centre of gravity for Fiziev means that when he does shoot in deep on the legs of Bahamondes on takedown attempts, naturally, because of the height difference, he's going to be in quite deep on the legs of Bahamondes, which can result in him having quite a lot of success in grappling compared to if he were to face someone of a similar size. And so, not impossible Fiziev grapples this weekend. It's unlikely, to be fair, but it's just something to keep on our radar. In terms of how these two match up when it comes to striking, I think this is a really difficult fight for Fiziev, because his style of striking is kicks based. So it's very difficult to get to your opponent when there's a big size and reach differential with boxing. And even very high level boxers are going to struggle with the size and reach differential you have in this matchup when you compound the two together. It's even more difficult to close the distance, because it takes longer to set kicks up than punches. Kicks require your feet, which means your feet have to move with footwork to kind of get the kick off in the first place, which again, it's harder to get kicks off than punches. And even if you do get your kicking game going, you're not really going to be able to land kicks particularly high up just because of physics. Like, you can land your leg kicks, you can land your body kicks, but in terms of like damaging, impactful head kicks, 5'8" versus 6'3" makes that very difficult. And Bahamondes uses his length well. He's got good footwork and movement. He does get dinged from time to time, don't get me wrong, but that's mainly because he loves a scrap. and he doesn't mind hanging in the pocket and exchanging. And so he will get caught from time to time. But with that being said, he is a tough Latin American. He can take a shot, and he's pretty durable. If you look at his record, he's actually never been knocked out, which is pretty impressive. 22 pro fights, no losses by knockout. So for a guy that likes to stand and bang as much as he does, I think that speaks volumes about his toughness and his durability. Yes, we've seen him dinged and rocked a few times. The McDessie fight, good example. However, he's still very difficult to put away. Fiziev's also a tough guy, though. If you look at his record, you know, he's only been KO'd one time in his career. And to be fair, Bahamondes isn't that dangerous on the feet. With Bahamondes, it's more death by 1,000 cuts. He breaks you down with volume as opposed to landing those big, powerful kill shots. But, yeah, on the feet, I think Bahamondes is just going to have that volume, the jab, to just use his length to chip away at Fiziev and outpoint him and outstrike him by a pretty wide margin. So it is a very difficult stylistic matchup for Fiziev. And like I say, if this fight were taking place on neutral territory, I would absolutely rush out and bet Bahamondes. I think he'd be a great bet. But I do think it's going to be difficult for him to get his hand raised and win a decision in Baku against Azerbaijan's, you know, biggest name MMA fighter. So if we take a look at the over-under, I do think this fight is likely to go quite deep, but the odds prevent me from betting on the fight to go deep because they are steep favourite odds. This is one of those fights where I really don't like to entertain the under and over. I really don't like to consider taking the over, just because even though when you look at their records, you know, they frequently go deep in fights. With Bahamondes, he's a volume striker that frequently goes deep. When you look at Fiziev, for the most part, he's an absolute decision machine as he's faced a higher level of opponent. At the same time, same thing I will say about Hill and Rountree. When you've got two strikers that are unlikely to look to grapple, they don't really spend much time in the clinch, and they're likely to meet head on, often something has to give. And often the thing that gives is someone's consciousness. So with that being said, even though I think the most likely outcome is this fight to go deep, if I were to bet this fight, I would... It's tough. I would probably... I don't know. I would stay away from the over-under on this one if I were you. I think the odds are priced probably where they should be. I don't see any value on either side. In terms of the prop bets on this one, I think most likely outcome is Bahamondes by decision, which is ironic because I've said throughout this analysis that I don't like Bahamondes' chances of getting his hand raised if this fight goes the distance due to Fiziev's home advantage. But undeniably that is the most likely outcome because Fiziev is a tough fucker and he is difficult to put away. And with Bahamondes not having too much power in his hands, this fight's more likely to go deep. So, hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Curtis Blaydes versus Rizvan Kuniev. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Curtis Blaydes is the favourite at average odds of about 1.40, which is going to be minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. If we take a look at the odds on Kuniev, he's around an average of about 3.0, which is going to be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. Curtis Blaydes is 34 years old, 6'4", with an 80-inch reach, and Kuniev is 32 years old, 6'4", with a 76-inch reach. So you can see a very nice 4-inch reach advantage there for Blaydes, and both guys are about the same size. To be honest, they've both kind of got similar styles of fighting as well. Neither guy is particularly technical or effective on the feet, and neither guy has too much power on the feet either. I know that Blaydes has got the odd random knockout here and there against, you know, fucking, I was going to say Tom Aspinall, but obviously that was an injury. Chris Daukaus was a legit knockout. Almeida was a strange knockout with hammer fists up against the cage. But, yeah, both guys for the most part volume strikers. Even though this is the heavyweight division, neither of these has too much power, which is where Blaydes, being a pretty big favourite, starts to get justified. Because if we consider the way in which Blaydes usually runs into trouble in fights, it's him either getting knocked out or, you know, running into a guy that is a better striker that he can't take down. And Kuniev's striking is worse than Blaydes. He's quite sloppy, he's quite slow, he's one of these stuck in the mud, flat-footed heavyweights. For all of Blaydes' weaknesses on the feet, he is more athletic, he is faster, he's got better footwork, he's got better movement, he does have better hands. So where you've got, you know, two guys that are primarily grapplers, if the grappling were to cancel out here and we ended up in a situation where you've got two heavyweights in a stand-up fight, Kuniev is flat-footed and slow and not that powerful. Blaydes isn't that powerful, but he's athletic, he's fast, he moves well. So you give Blaydes the advantage when it comes to striking. Now, in terms of cardio, obviously in the heavyweight division, fighters are more likely to slow down than lighter weight classes because they're bigger, heavier human beings. And in most heavyweight fights that we analyse, we do talk a lot about fighter cardio, but this would be one of those rare examples where both guys have pretty good cardio. So I wouldn't expect cardio to come into that based on past performances, but there is a caveat to that. And if we take a look at Kuniev's record, we can see that his Contender Series fight against Hugo Cunha ended just under 5 minutes. In fact, it was right on the bell. And so a fight that lasts 5 minutes doesn't tell us a whole lot about a fighter's cardio. We then have this fight in PFL against Reynan Ferreira, which did go deep, and Kuniev's cardio looked fantastic. However, Kuniev did fail a drugs test, and as a result, the outcome of the fight was overturned. And so this does pose the question as to whether Kuniev had good cardio as a heavyweight pre-Hugo Cunha because he was using performance-enhancing drugs, or does he just have good cardio? So we're left wondering, what is the impact on Kuniev's ability level and cardio now that he is potentially fighting clean for the first time in his career, but also potentially not fighting clean and still being a juice head. Personally, I don't understand why the UFC would give a contract to a fighter, would invite a fighter onto the Contender Series with a view to earning a place in the UFC when in 2023 the guy failed a drug test in the fight immediately before the Contender Series matchup. It feels a bit sketchy. The UFC do make a lot of questionable, they do take a lot of questionable decisions these days. I would always like to give people the benefit of the doubt and would hope the reason why he got the fight in the Contender Series was because a contract had been already offered, or an opportunity had already been offered prior to the drug test failure. Although with it being over a year between the two fights, that seems unlikely. And then that doesn't explain why he would be given a contract in light of the failed drugs test in PFL. If the UFC did truly care about the integrity of the sport and making it a clean sport, they probably wouldn't be offering a contract to a guy like Kuniev. But maybe I'm missing a key detail there, and maybe I'm wrong. So with the failed drug test, what I can tell you is in the past his cardio looked good, but without performance enhancing drugs this weekend, that might change, in which case Blaydes would have a big advantage when it comes to cardio, because outside of the Alexander Volkov fight, we've never really seen Curtis Blaydes slow down. He's got really good cardio for a heavyweight. So the way that I would approach a situation like that from a betting point of view would be assume based on past performances, have the initial thought that both guys have stellar cardio for heavyweights, but be mindful if live betting this matchup that Kuniev's cardio may not be consistent with past performances due to the potential he's no longer on performance enhancing drugs. So in terms of how they match up when it comes to grappling, Kuniev is like a wet blanket grinder, push you into the cage and hug you to death kind of guy. And where you do get a bit of that with Blaydes, I think the real difference here is Blaydes is athletic enough and technical enough to have a bit of chain wrestling about him, shoot those nice single leg, double leg takedown entries, and reasonably good grappling control. Blaydes is also a lot more difficult to hold down and take down than Kuniev. I have seen some situations where Kuniev has given up cheap takedowns or, given up position on the ground, made basic errors. And while nobody's perfect and Blaydes can certainly make mistakes too, Kuniev is far more likely to make basic fundamental mistakes in MMA grappling positions than Curtis Blaydes is. And so for that reason, you gotta kind of accept Blaydes as a big favourite here and respect the fact that it's pretty unlikely he will lose. Perhaps Kuniev will have some kind of home advantage. He's not from Azerbaijan, but if you watch MMA Guru's content, perhaps you'll guess what I'm alluding to. I don't want to really say either way how much of an influence home advantage could have on this fight, because I don't know if Kuniev will have home advantage, but what I do know is he's more likely to get perhaps a little bit of favoritism from the judges than Blaydes. With that being said, I still like Blaydes in this fight, and I would not bet Kuniev. And if you're going to bet this fight, I would just take Blaydes. I don't even think this is one of those dog or pass situations. I think Blaydes is, 20 to 40% better than Kuniev everywhere. And with the failed drug test and the potential that he's now fighting clean, it's also possible that Kuniev could look way worse than past fights. So in terms of the over-under on this one, the odds are steep on the over 1.5 rounds, but this is a bet that is very interesting to me, and this is a bet that is potentially pretty tempting, just based on the fact that neither guy is particularly dangerous. We've already said that they don't really have knockout power. That doesn't mean with two big old guys like this, someone can't land a shot and knock the other out. Anything's possible, but neither of these are really that dangerous on the feet. And Kuniev is one of these guys that usually likes to just come forward, grab a hold of you, drive you into the cage, and just kind of battle for position up against the cage in the clinch. At which case, we know in that position, out of all the positions in MMA, finishes are the most likely there. So both guys are probably skilled enough grapplers to kind of hang with each other in grappling positions and in the clinch, making a finish unlikely. I don't love the odds on the over 1.5 rounds, but I do think is very, very likely to hit. So that, if you're not opposed to betting things at big favourite odds, might be something you want to consider. In terms of the props on this one, I think the most likely outcome is going to be Blaydes by decision, but the odds reflect that with, not being particularly good odds. 3.0 plus 220 for a highly specific outcome. It's not great, because you got to consider if Kuniev does look terrible after coming off performance enhancing drugs, Blaydes could just be too much for him. Like, it is possible. Failing that, there's not a whole lot I like. You could go for a speculative bet on Blaydes to win in round 3. The odds range isn't as high as I would want. If it was like in this odds range, it would be a lot more attractive to me. And I would only go for this on the basis that perhaps Kuniev's fighting clean for the first time, which will, lead to him not having particularly good cardio this weekend. But it's an assumption, and not an assumption that I think we're getting a particularly good deal in the odds if we were to bet. So probably best to pass on that one. Now let's break down another really interesting fight on this card, which is going to be Tofik Musayev versus Miktabek Orolbai. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Orolbai is the favourite at average odds of about 1.61, which is going to be minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. We take a look at the odds on Musayev. He's around an average of 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So Orolbai, 27 years old, 5'10" with a 74-inch reach. Musayev is 35 years old, 5'10" with a 72-inch reach. So we can see both guys are about the same size. There is a pretty big difference in age between these two. We can see that Orolbai is 8 years younger than Musayev. I wouldn't necessarily expect this to have too much of an influence on the fight in terms of, I wouldn't expect Musayev to be declining at this age, and I wouldn't expect Orolbai to kind of have a huge edge based on the fact that he's fighting an older declining fighter. 35 certainly isn't young for a lightweight, but Musayev hasn't faced like a super high level of opponent, so he probably hasn't taken, you know, the kind of damage your average 35-year-old UFC fighter with 27 pro fights has faced. We do know Musayev is unlikely to look better than he has in past performances at this age, but what we do know is at 27 years old, we could see, you know, big improvements from fight to fight in Orolbai. So this fight is a tricky one to give you good quality analysis for, because even though Musayev has had 27 pro fights, and you can see, you know, his recent fights have lasted a good amount of time, just with the way that these fights have played out and with the quality of footage that is available online in terms of like camera angles and camera quality, it's very difficult to know what to expect from Musayev in this fight. I know it sounds crazy because he's fought 5 times since 2019, and a few of these fights, 3 of these fights, his last 3 fights have lasted a good amount of time. We can't actually learn too much about Musayev from these 3 fights. They don't tell us a whole lot, which is disappointing. And really, you've got to go all the way back to his fight in 2019, 6 years ago, against Patricky Pitbull, to get a good look at him. And that's problematic because obviously he can improve a lot in the last 6 years. He can obviously decline a lot as well, but it's more likely that he would improve. So making decisions based on a fight that took place 6 years ago probably isn't wise. Now, there may be other analysts that are able to draw, you know, stronger conclusions and give you better analysis on these 5 fights than I can. But after watching as much footage of these 5 fights as I could find, and some of these fights are pretty tricky to get hold of, I was left feeling a little bit uncertain as to what Musayev's strengths and weaknesses are relative to that performance in 2019, where you can get a good look at him, the camera quality, the footage, everything's good, and you see, you know, a diverse, wide range of skills tested and displayed. And so when we look at this fight, based on the last time we got a good look at Musayev, this is a very good stylistic matchup for Orolbai, and I'm very, very high on Orolbai. I think Orolbai is excellent. He's got great cardio. He's tough as nails. He showed that with how much damage he took in the Mateusz Rebecki fight and still kept pushing, still tried to, you know, push for the win. Even after his orbital bone was cracked in the first round and his face was decimated, he still had that strong will to win even deep into the 3rd round. His cardio is great, tough as nails, reasonably technical striking, really good MMA grappling. Do feel he made a tactical error in the Rebecki fight by not grappling more. I think one of the reasons why he ended up losing a split decision is because he spent too much time standing and banging with a big power striker, as opposed to mixing things up a little bit more and using his more diverse skill set than Rebecki, who's more of a slugger. But he's 27 years old and he's got time on his side, and I'm sure he's going to learn from that. And so this is one of those matchups where, based on past performances, Orolbai does look better than Musayev in every single aspect of MMA. Significantly better MMA grappling, much more technical striking, just a much more well-rounded fighter. And on top of that, he is also kind of battle-tested. So his cardio is proven, and we know that this is the kind of guy that you're going to have to damn near kill in order to finish, because we've seen him take an ungodly amount of damage early in the Mateusz Rebecki fight, and he still pushed and kept going. So while I'm not doubting Musayev's ability to go to those deep, dark places as well, For me, we've seen it with Orolbai and he's proven, whereas this is Musayev's UFC debut, and these Bellator / Rising guys haven't exactly been doing particularly well when transitioning into the UFC over the last couple of years, with the likes of Patricky Mix, Pitbull, and MVP looking a little lackluster. I know that MVP has had the odd decent performance here and there, but certainly didn't live up to the type of hype that he had coming into the promotion, where people were talking about title picture before he even made his debut. The other X factor for us to talk about, the only other one we haven't really explored, is that Musayev, you can see him here rocking the Azerbaijani flag, and so like we said about Fiziev, he will have home advantage on his side. The UFC have not done events in Baku in the past, so we don't know to what extent home advantage will play a part in this weekend's fights. What we do know is that it will be the IMMAF team of officials, which is the same team of officials that police events in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. And we do know that home advantage for certain types of fighters is very strong under that federation of MMA officials. And so, while we don't have conclusive evidence home advantage will be a big factor this weekend, it's reasonable for us to assume it will. And so I will give the same opinion and analysis on this fight that I'll give on the other fights involving Azerbaijani fighters, in that if you do want to bet this fight, from my perspective, you need to either be pretty confident Orolbai can win inside the distance, or you need to be confident in his ability to win 2 out of 3 rounds beyond all reasonable doubt, and in a level of dominance that would make it almost impossible for the judges to screw the decision at, which, as we know, if we watch the sport every week, it's difficult to get to that level of confidence in MMA, unfortunately, due to the state of MMA judging. So this is one of those fights where if you want to bet this fight, you have to take Orolbai, quite simply based on past performances. He's better than Musayev everywhere. That doesn't mean Musayev can't show up looking like a UFC champion this weekend, with his last 5 fights being a little bit difficult to interpret. But certainly what I have seen from him, he's going to be outgunned everywhere against Orolbai. I think Orolbai is pretty legit, and I think Orolbai is potentially one to watch in the lightweight division. The heart, the determination, the durability he showed in his fight against Rebecca is the stuff of champions. It's what makes champions ultimately. You can't train that kind of heart. You can't buy that kind of heart. And while I would have liked to have seen him mix things up and grapple a little bit more, nobody's perfect. And Orolbai is young enough at 27 years old to have learned a lot from that experience. So in terms of the over-under on this one, again, without being able to give you like really good quality analysis as to what to expect from Musayev's last sort of 5 fights, very difficult to predict the over-under or highly specific outcomes like prop bets with a good degree of accuracy or even confidence. With that being said, with how both these two match up from a stylistic point of view, you would have to lean more towards this fight going deep, just because of how tough and well-rounded they both are. We know they make them extremely tough in this part of the world. Orolbai's proven that. Sure, Musayev is likely to prove that as well, although has been finished a couple times in the last 5 fights, which, may be a bit of a red flag as to Musayev's skill level, but anyone can get caught. It is what it is. So yeah, with these guys, being pretty well-rounded, most likely this fight will go deep, but I don't feel really confident in what to expect from Musayev this weekend. So with the props, that's also difficult. And my only real, analysis on this one is, if you want to bet this fight, I would again not get too cute and overcomplicate things. I would just take Orolbai money line. So let me know what you think. If you do have more information on Musayev, I'd really appreciate it if you could slide by the Discord, link in the description below if you're not in the Discord already, and just let me know what you know about this guy, how you feel about this fight. I'd appreciate that, because this is probably the only fight on the card I'm really struggling with in terms of having a confident read on how it's likely to go and the strengths and weaknesses of both fighters. In this next fight, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Nazim Sadykhov versus Nicholas Motta. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Sadykhov is one of the biggest favourites on the card at average odds of about 1.23, which is going to be minus 435 for an implied probability of 81%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent Motta, he's around an average of 4.30, which is going to be plus 330 for an implied probability of 23%. So Sadykhov is 31 years old, 5'10" with a 69-inch reach. Motta is 32 years old, 5'9" with a 70-inch reach. So we can see both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size, actually roughly the same body type as well. So nothing too major going on there. The only other X factor for us to consider is that Sadykhov, even though he's from the United States, you can see the Serra-Longo logo in the background, the New England Patriots, he is repping Azerbaijan. So he will have home advantage on his side. So I'll say the same thing about this fight that I will say about the other fighters on this card from Azerbaijan. If you do want to bet Motta this weekend, you have to feel either comfortable that he can win inside the distance and take the judges out of the equation, or win 2 out of 3 rounds beyond all reasonable doubt, because we know it's not going to be easy for Motta to win a competitive fight by decision in Azerbaijan against the guy repping the Azerbaijani flag. We don't know for sure, but that's most likely the outcome based on how events usually go in this part of the world. MMA Guru has spoken about this extensively. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, this is probably the main fight on this card that I look at and feel the odds are extremely wide. This is one of those classic examples where I feel the odds are based on an assumption as to a game plan and strategy that a fighter will use, but they're not necessarily reflecting all ways in which this matchup could play out. So where we see Sadykhov as a big favourite, those odds carry an implied probability of 81%, which implies that he has, major advantages pretty much everywhere and has very little chance of losing this. That's the case when it comes to grappling, but if the fight stays standing, in my opinion, this fight is very close to 50-50. And so where this matchup gets interesting is that Sadykhov is one of these guys that doesn't usually grapple all that much. He can grapple, and he's a good grappler, and if he does use a grappling heavy game plan in this fight against Motta, he will likely win very easily because Motta is relatively easy to take down and hold down. But even though, to those of us that try to apply logic to analysing this sport, every weekend we see situations, on 3 or 4 fights, sometimes more, where specific fighters have clear and obvious paths to victory, and for whatever reason they don't take that clear and obvious path to victory, and instead they do something different, which results in a fight either being much closer than it needed to be, or results in them losing. And this is a concept we talk about every week in these videos, and Sadykhov is a candidate for making that same mistake, because this is a fight where he's facing a dangerous striker who's technical and who is skilled, and he has a big advantage on the ground, but he's also had big advantages on the ground against past opponents. Vyacheslav is a good example, and in my opinion he didn't grapple anywhere near as much as he should have to fight safe and smart. There was some grappling in the Borshev fight, particularly late in round 3, but we know Borshev hits very hard, and Sadykhov made a conscious decision in that fight to stand and bang with Borshev and risk getting knocked out rather than taking the safer approach and just using a grappling heavy game plan, when we know Borshev has pretty bad takedown defense and he's not great on the ground. So if you consider the challenge that Sadykhov now faces this weekend in Nicholas Motta, the dynamic of this matchup is very similar to the dynamic between the Sadykhov-Borshev fight, where Motta, just like Borshev, has issues on the ground, but he is a dangerous striker with very heavy hands. And for Sadykhov to show a reluctance to grapple as much as he should against Borshchev makes it more likely he'll make the same mistake against Motta, which means Sadykhov runs the risk of playing with fire and getting burnt, because Motta, very fast, very accurate, very fluid, dangerous boxing with true legit knockout power, true legit one-shot knockout power. And I know Sadykhov hits hard as well, but both these guys like to play rock'em sock'em robots. And in a situation where you've got two guys that like to stand and bang, and they've both got the power to put the other away at any moment, when you have one guy as a huge underdog, like we always say, let the odds do the work for you, don't overthink it, and just take the underdog in a fight like this. So Motta is very tempting in this fight, because even though I think it's more likely Sadykhov will win, the odds are very wide here. And in order to get any value on Sadykhov at all, you've got to give him a better than 82% chance of winning. The way I view this fight is, if you came to me with a crystal ball and you said, Chris, I can see how this fight is going to play out, I can see into the future, I absolutely guarantee you that Sadykhov will grapple his ass off for 3 rounds. How do you see this fight playing out? How would you cap it? I would probably cap it like this. But based on the Borshchev fight, I feel Sadykhov is more likely to stand and bang more than he should, which pushes these odds closer to the even money odds range. And so it's clearly dog or pass on this one. Having said that, there's obviously 2 major risk factors with betting Nicholas Motta, which if you are betting him this weekend, you're going to have to accept as just part of the course. Because obviously, if there weren't significant risk factors associated with betting someone like Nicholas Motta, he wouldn't be in this odds range. It's extremely rare that you get fighters in this odds range that don't have major potential weaknesses that their opponents could potentially exploit. And so the 2 issues with Nicholas Motta this weekend, obviously we've spoken about Sadykhov's home advantage, but on top of that, we know Motta is pretty easy to take down and hold down. The 3rd round of the Trey Ogden fight showed that. I wouldn't say Motta's takedown offense is terrible, but a bit of chain wrestling can for sure get him down, and we know he's weak off his back. So if Sadykhov does come into the fight with a grappling heavy game plan, Motta is screwed, but past performances tell us Sadykhov's probably not going to do that, especially because he does seem like a bit of a crazy guy that likes to put on a show. So with it being, his first main card appearance, hometown fans on his side, this guy is crazy and strikes me as the guy that is going to want to go for a bonus and put on a show, which more than likely means engaging in a firefight with a guy that has some pretty dangerous weapons himself. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I would be surprised if this one goes to a decision. The odds are pretty steep on the under 2.5 rounds, as well as fight not to go to a decision. And while they are too steep for me to take a shot on it, those odds are certainly steep enough for me to be scared off of this one. I would be surprised if this went the distance, just because whichever position this fight goes to, there's going to be significant chance of a finish. So if it stays standing, they both have true legit knockout power. They both get into big exchanges. They're both capable of knocking one another out. We've both seen them demonstrate big power in past fights. If it goes to the ground, Motta has shown a relatively low-level ground game in the Trey Ogden fight, so it's relatively likely that Sadykhov could either get a submission finish or put Motta in a position where he's not able to defend himself, and he could kind of get that TKO or KO stoppage. So the odds are steep, but I would not be taking the over or fight goes to a decision on this one. In terms of the props, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because the odds on Motta to win by knockout or TKO in percentage terms for a highly specific outcome don't make... There's not too much of a difference in percentage terms for the additional risk you're taking on to go Motta wins by knockout or TKO over the money line. even though if Motta wins, it is most likely going to be by knockout or TKO. It's not impossible Motta can't win by decision, but obviously it's not going to be easy for him to win a decision against an Azerbaijani in Azerbaijan. We know this. So most likely outcome is actually probably Sadykhov decision, but the odds aren't great. And so there's a bunch of props that I like, that they are not necessarily like. I'm not going to say there's a bunch of props on this fight that I like, because I don't like them. But there are multiple props on this fight which I think are reasonably likely to hit. But the problem is, and if you look at my analysis for all the other fights on this card, there hasn't been another fight where I've given, like, 2 or 3 or 4 recommendations for different prop bets, because the other fights on this card don't really have as many variables to explore. The reason why we've got more potential prop bets on a fight like this is because there's more ways that it could play out, right? Depending on what game plan and strategy Sadykhov uses. And without a crystal ball, we don't know what game plan and strategy Sadykhov is going to use, because he's very capable of grappling, but there's evidence in the past to suggest this weekend he won't. So if Sadykhov comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, Sadykhov by decision becomes far more likely. But if both guys stand and bang for 3 rounds, one of these dudes winning by knockout or TKO becomes a lot more likely. I will say the odds on Sadykhov to win by knockout or TKO being significantly steeper than Motta's odds to win by knockout or TKO are highly questionable, because Motta's the more technical striker, and while I understand he has been KO'd a couple times in UFC fights, it only takes one shot, and he is still a dangerous striker. He's more technical than Sadykhov and a lot faster. So those odds feeling wide, money line odds feeling wide. Bottom line, if you're going to bet this fight, don't touch Sadykhov. No upside in betting him at these odds. 82% implied probability. It's a scam. Take Motta or pass. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Bogdan Grad versus Mohamed Naimov. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Naimov is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.38, which is going to be minus 263 for an implied probability of 72%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent Grad, he's around an average of 3.05, which is going to be plus 205 for an implied probability of 33%. So Grad is 29 years old, 5'8" with a 70-inch reach. And Naimov, 30 years old, 5'9" with a 70-inch reach. So both guys virtually the same size, virtually the same, height, age, everything, and pretty much the same body types as well. Small, muscular, and compact. So this is one of those matchups where Bogdan has been under the UFC umbrella for 2 fights now. He appeared on the Contender Series one time and then made his debut. This is one of those situations where a fighter's picked up a couple of wins but has looked relatively low level from a technical point of view in both fights. He is tough, he does hit very hard, he's aggressive, he's game, he's mean, he's nasty, he's scrappy. Those qualities go a long way in the UFC. However, from a technical point of view, Grad is lacking pretty bad everywhere. He's one of these guys that does come out the gate super hard, hits very hard, has major, true legit one-shot knockout power, but he does fade as fights wear on, and he does become considerably less dangerous as fights wear on. His MMA grappling also isn't the best. This can be masked by him having some success with grappling in past fights, but that tends to be based on aggression and power and athleticism as opposed to technique. And so when he starts to tire, his MMA grappling, for the most part, is completely ineffective because he doesn't have that high-level technique to fall back on. So Grad is just a scrappy slugger on the feet, and he hustles hard on the ground with strength and power and physicality. But fundamentally, outside of raw power and athleticism, there's not a lot that Grad brings to the table which is particularly good. But having said that, like GSP famously said, fighting is 90% mental. And, this was shown in the last fight, right, against Lucas Alexander, where it was quite clear Alexander was the superior fighter everywhere, but it was Grad's toughness and mentality that kept pushing and was inevitably the difference between the two and resulted in Grad being the one that got the win. So this is one of those fights where, from a technical point of view, Naimov is better than Grad everywhere. You know, more technical striking, definitely a better MMA grappler for sure. Like, this is a fight where, you know, if these two grapple, Naimov will be the guy that comes out on top. Far more physically imposing, far better grappling control, far better offensive wrestling and chain wrestling. So Naimov the more technical striker, Naimov the better grappler as well. And we know Naimov's biggest weakness is he tends to slow down in fights, but that is not as big of a problem in a matchup like this because Grad slows down as well. Grad might be tougher and more game and more capable of pushing through, you know, fighting when he gets tired than Naimov, but both guys are still going to slow down, so they're both going to probably look pretty sloppy in the second half of this fight. Having said that, when Naimov first came into the UFC, he was one of these guys that would come out the gate super hard and aggressive, and then he would fade. But now he's getting better at pacing himself and his cardio is improving. And it's also possible Grad's cardio will improve. Now he's had 2 fights under the UFC umbrella. So this is one of those matchups where Naimov's odds carry an implied probability of about 70%. He is better than Grad everywhere. And so this is one of those matchups where, you know, it's hard to bet Grad at an implied probability of 70% because he's facing a guy who's dangerous. Like, Grad hits hard, you can't take that away. It only takes one shot to land in MMA for someone's night to be over. So this is one of those matchups where I don't see enough in Grad as the underdog to want to bet him. But for me, Naimov is far too big of a favourite for it to make sense betting him either, because if you bet $1,000 on Naimov, you only get $400 profit. It's a pretty bad risk to reward ratio against someone as dangerous as Grad, even though from a technical point of view, you know, he's probably in a lot of trouble. Now, in terms of the over-under on this one, my lean would be on this fight not to go to a decision. So you can see that that is in the even money odds range. My rationale for this fight being more likely to end inside the distance is that Grad's very aggressive. So whenever you've got a guy like Grad that will initiate action, either in the form of grappling positions or striking positions, again, like we've said throughout this video analysing other fights, something usually has to give, and something often gives in the form of someone's consciousness, especially when both these guys are kind of tanky and hit hard, and especially when there's a potential that one or both of these guys could tire out to the point where they're too tired to defend themselves adequately, making a finish more likely. And so I do think this fight's more likely to end inside the distance. If you look at their records, you can see it's very rare Naimov goes to a decision, and also, very rare Grad goes to a decision. And if you look at Naimov's record, you know, he doesn't fight the decisions all that often either. It tends to be like a 50-50 split throughout his career. And even when he's faced a bit of a bumping competition, you know, 3 of his last 5 have also ended inside the distance. So with that being said, the under on this fight is actually pretty tempting, and it is a bet that I'll be considering myself this week. In terms of the most likely outcome for the props, I think the most likely outcome is Naimov by decision, just because of how tough I think Grad's going to be. But the odds are absolutely shocking, so I wouldn't touch that. They're very bad. You could go for fight ends in round 3 on the basis that one or both of these fighters may become too tired to defend themselves, making a finish in round 3 far more likely. But with that being said, again, the odds aren't quite as nice as I would have liked. Although, to be fair, we've got a big spread here. So this is showing odds of 8.5. This is showing odds of 14.0. So if you can get 14.0 plus 1,300, that's a great bet. If you're only looking at 8.5 plus 750, not so much. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, please hit the like button below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. Link in the description below. Join our live betting group where we make a profit most weeks. And if you watch every UFC event live, it's an absolute no-brainer joining us. Hopefully, you can kind of sense that from the level of depth that we go into when analysing these fights. That level of depth is what gives us such a big edge when we live bet these matchups. So I appreciate you listening if you got this far. Have a great week, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Nice one, guys. Bye.